Hey folks, how's it going? I hope everybody's doing well. I'm having a tough time because I recently got COVID, but you might notice that I have a smile on my face, and that's because I recently figured out something that I've been trying to do for like a few months now, which is photon reconnections in Unity. So basically, Photon is, I think, the most popular, at least for indies, the most popular uh, backend for multiplayer support, particularly PUN, which is the Photon Unity multiplayer system, the PUN system. And they do what is client authoritative multiplayer kind of gameplay. And client authoritative is not the most popular when it comes to AAA games. It's pretty much always dedicated servers that you're going to want, but it's free and it's accessible, and I think that's why it's kind of become the most popular. And that's what I'm using today for my game. So I've got three different windows open here, two on the left and then the Unity window itself on the right. And we've got a little game here for my current prototype game called Breach Buddies. And I'm going to start this game up just by pushing this button. And today we're talking about disconnections. And the most common disconnection I face is actually just when I'm developing the game, I'm constantly setting breakpoints. And when I set a breakpoint, the result is that I get disconnected because the packets aren't able to send for maybe a minute or two. So I'm going to simulate that by going in a Visual Studio here. So I want you to notice this. We're currently in a game. We have two players on our team. And if I go to one of these other displays, you'll see that where it says send memes over there in the bottom right over here where my mouse will be, right about there, it's green, right above that clock symbol. It's just a nice green and white thing. That's going to be relevant to remember. Just remember that icon. So I'm going to attach to Unity here with Visual Studio. And we're just going to simulate what that reconnection looks like as I talk about some other stuff. Okay, so we're attaching. We're practicing our patience here. We're testing our patience. We're becoming impatient. We're getting angry. We're becoming livid. And now we're relieved because we've connected. Okay, so now we're going to put a little breakpoint right here. And again, this is simulating what I do all the time. I'm setting a breakpoint. I'm looking at variables. And after I'm in this state for a little while, I want to be able to jump back into the game and keep testing stuff. But unfortunately, with the default way things work, after you've been in the breakpoint, the packets don't get sent and you get disconnected. So we're going to talk about how to fix that. Now, I originally made this post here on the Photon forums, which are not that great. And nobody helped me for a month from March up here to April. And I said, I think I have figured it out, but really I didn't. And it's funny because then I found this other post from this guy back in 2018. And he was like, I'm having some trouble, and here's some more details, and here's some more details. And then he's like, hey, I figured it out. And then he's like, actually, I didn't. Which seems to be, and of course, nobody's helping this guy either. Because I don't think these forums get read too often. I've honestly had more luck going on Reddit. So that's why I'm making this video today. So I think that's been long enough for us to be in the breakpoint here. So I'm going to take that breakpoint off, or I'll just disable it like this. And then we'll continue. And let's see whether or not... Oh, okay. Let's see whether or not that was enough time for us to get a disconnection. And it looks like it was. So here's what happened here. We're just going to look into the log. Trying to find the relevant issue here. So here's where we attempted a post-disconnection recovery. We reconnected and rejoined with success. We reconnected and we were able to join the room. And I know that text might be a little small, but I'm just reading to you what it says. And then down here, we found a duplicate Photon view with the same ID as us. And so we deleted the duplicate. okay? And now we're back into the game, and we're able to shoot bullets, which is pretty cool. That means that we're able to, actively go into the game here. We can, again, put a new breakpoint. We can do some debugging. However, you will notice that while we were away, this guy got a skull icon. Okay, so previously it was white and green. Now it's a skull. And that's because the way that my game currently doesn't anticipate players to come back after a disconnection. So you need to do additional server-side code to handle that. However, your game will handle that, right? Because in my game, I kill the person when they disconnect. But if you want to handle that in a different way, then you got to do it your own way, right? And looks like some collection I'm looking at. I went out of bounds on the size there. That's what that red text is saying. So all of that is to say that this was a success. We were able to successfully reconnect. And then, it's up to you where the game is going to handle that. So let me talk to you about some of the things that I've done in order to allow that success to happen. Because prior to this, if I had a breakpoint and then I tried to continue after that breakpoint, even after only, looking at it for like a minute, the game would essentially crash and I wouldn't be able to, be in the scene as I am now. And so the most important thing to start with is actually something that I learned when I got to one of these forum posts here. It's that any objects which are created by a player are deleted by default when that player disconnects. Now that's a big issue because when the player disconnects, you don't necessarily want to delete that information, because when he reconnects, he's not going to be able to repossess that player character. So this guy ultimately ends his post crying out into the void, asking for help. And Tobias helped him out earlier, but it looks like he's on his own now. So we're going to help him out. We're going to answer a comment linking to this video. But basically, he wants to prevent local cleanup anything instantiated from being called. And that's exactly what we needed to do. So if I find that in my shared solution here with PUN, we're going to jump over that here. Here is the method. It's in Photon Network part.cs, internal static void, local cleanup, anything instantiated. And it's here that I have an early exit if I don't want. This is something I wrote these 2 lines of code. These 2 lines are new. So basically in my settings object, I have a variable called don't destroy on leave. And if that is set, then I override whatever destroy instantiated game objects is, and I always set it to false. And so these 2 lines are essentially what prevents that character from being destroyed when the player leaves. Now, this is within its own DLL, I think is the term. So you might experience some difficulty in getting your code to be called from the Photon network code because it's in its own, namespace and Photon PUN and all that stuff. So as a little, if you're not familiar with this, then this is kind of complicated and it's not something that I'm probably going to be able to fully explain right now. But there are these things called import settings. I think that's what they're called. .asm defs. So I guess that's an assembly definition. That's probably what it stands for. And by default, whenever a package is created, they often include these things, unless I made it myself, which I don't think I did. And so it's here within this assembly definition that you can add assembly definition references. So I've added one to my own assembly definition called BB shared. And it's here not in my scripts folder, but I have a separate scripts folder called shared scripts. Sorry, I've got COVID. And here I have the BB shared assembly definition, which includes my settings object. That way my settings object can be referenced in really any DLL I use, any third-party integration such as Photon or Opsiv. If I'm adding in their code, I can call some of my code from their code. How much of my code? Well, basically just whatever's included in this folder. And in this case, the main object is my settings object, which is basically, I could pull that up for us. It's basically just a long list of variables that I use to tune stuff. And one of those things that I tune are the Photon parameters, which I have here. And so the top one is don't destroy on leave. So that's the most important step for you to do first, is basically prevent the thing from being destroyed when you disconnect. The next thing that we'll talk about is how to prevent disconnections. And we have some options here. Now, the disconnect timeout is a variable that I set. And where that is used is right here in the Photon network keep alive in background. And I've got to be honest with you folks, I have no idea what keep alive in background does. It says that it controls basically how long the client is online if on application pause is called. But in my experience, that's not accurate, because the timeout here says, you know, I have it set to debug right now, so it's supposed to be 10 minutes, and I totally didn't have it pause for 10 minutes before I got disconnected. And again, it really couldn't be 10 minutes anyway, because there are hard limits to this, as I'll explain in a minute. So really, the keep alive in background thing, I don't know if it's doing any work at all. Might be able to just delete that. But there are some important settings up here, which I'd like to talk to you about. So these settings are being applied in my create room function. So this is when I create a new room. And basically, you're going to set a bunch of room options here. And then those options are ultimately what you pass into the Photon network create room function. And so some of these options that prevent us from disconnecting are, let me see this one. So the first one is clean up cache on leave. So what this does is it prevents us from losing any of the properties that a player set when they leave the game. And then in these two as well. So here, this max players thing is kind of unrelated, so I'll put it right here. I'll do this, and then I'll say this is the disconnection params. Okay. So the first one here is PlayerTTL. TTL stands for time to live, and this basically determines how long the server can go without receiving an update from a particular player before it takes out the axe and chops that player and kills them. So in this case, I think the default is 1 minute, 60 seconds. But you can set it to -1, which is a sentinel value that means no timeout, in which case the player will never have their head chopped off. The player will stay in the room until the room itself is killed. And so just like the player has a time to live, the room itself has a time to live. And so that room time to live basically represents if all the players have disconnected or are otherwise inactive, how long until the server kills the room itself. And so in this case, -1 is not an option, which kind of makes sense because otherwise Photon would have to support rooms that could exist for like years, right, with no players in them. So it makes sense that you kind of have to have a limit here. And honestly, I don't think this is explained super well in the documentation, and I'll cry about that in a second. But basically, there is a hard limit to this number, and that number is 30,000, which, you know, if 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second, oh, sorry, it's 300,000. So if 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second, that means it's 300,000, so 300 seconds, and 300 seconds works out to 5 minutes. So that's basically how long the room can be alive with no players in it, or no active players in it, at which point it's going to kill all the players. So if you set these settings just like this before you create your room, you can confirm that it's going to stay active for as long as possible before it gets chopped by the server. So let's cry a little bit when it comes to the documentation. I think there's a really good guide here. This is called, this is the Photon Engine's persistence guide, so you could check this out. And this includes the cheat sheet, which was super helpful for understanding that sentinel value of PlayerTTL -1. So I'd encourage you to read this documentation. Honestly, is Photon's documentation shit? No, it's okay. It's okay. Because this PlayerTTL, the way I found out about it was probably Okay, so player keep alive in background is here. So this is by default 60K, but it doesn't clarify what the max is, and they do that all the time. So you know what's interesting? I just searched for PlayerTTL on this page. It doesn't show up. But then if I go over here to this page, it shows up. PlayerTTL is here. So I don't know what's the difference here. It's just, honestly, navigating their documentation is a pain in the ass, right? Does it make me want to gouge my eyes out? No. But it's been very difficult. I mean, it's taken me 2 months to figure this shit out. All right, he's whining. Shut up. Keep moving. Okay, so PlayerTTL is here, right? But it's missing a lot of the important information, like that sentinel value, right? Like the fact that PlayerTTL -1 means something should certainly be conveyed in this blur, but it's not, because it's just not good. Like a lot of the information is scattered around all these different pages, and you gotta be a little sleuth in order to figure out, what the hell any of this means. So, all right, I'm complaining again. Where were we at? So I wanted to talk to you about something else, which is, okay, we've talked about how to prevent the player from being destroyed on disconnect. We've talked about how to prevent disconnects. Now I want to talk to you about how do you reconnect in the case of a disconnect. And that's exactly what we had seen there, right? In my little demo, when we saw attempting post-disconnection recovery, reconnect and rejoin success, I want to talk to you about how to write that code, because that's the most important part of getting your client back into the game after a disconnection has occurred. And all of that work happens in this script called reconnection.cs. Now, this script that I made was heavily inspired and informed by the example on Photon's website called Recover from Unexpected Disconnect Sample. Okay, which I just renamed to Reconnection. And this was actually linked on one of the yeah, I think this is what Willpower explained. This is what he said had helped him out, and it helped me out a lot as well. So the basic idea here is that you're going to create subscriptions to the load balancing client, specifically to this event called onDisconnect, at which point when you experience the onDisconnect, you will attempt a recovery, and then within the recovery, you'll go through a series of if statements attempting to reconnect and rejoin. And I think this is great. You could basically use their class exactly as it's set up here. I changed a few things to make it work a little bit better for my system, so I'll explain how that works for me. I have a persistent game logic object that stays alive and gets carried from scene to scene during my game. And in there's a whole bunch of different managers and stuff that I want to always be around, like the service locator, like my sound machine. And one of those is this new mono behavior I made called reconnection. And so that's basically what this is. I've changed it into a mono behavior. It's not a mono behavior in the documentation. So I added an additional parent class here to the class definition, or the class prototype, the header, basically. I've added that it's a child of mono behavior PUN callbacks. And then, as a mono behavior, I just keep it as a child to that persistent game object. And the reason why I wanted to subscribe to the mono behavior PUN callbacks is a few reasons. The first is so that I have start and on destroy, and that allows me to remove and attach the subscriptions. And the next thing I wanted to point out here is that on disconnect, I have a check to see whether or not I should reconnect, because there are some cases in the game where you want to disconnect, and in those cases, I basically say, do not attempt a reconnection. That was an issue I ran into where basically it was trying to reconnect even though I was trying to leave the game. You only want it to reconnect if the disconnection is unexpected, let's say. So here's the recover. Basically, it's exactly how it was before. I just added a bunch of success statements here. And so what I wanted to, the reason why I subscribe mainly to mono behavior PUN callbacks was so that I could override these methods. And I think these methods are actually very important to override in order to get the full picture of what's going on, because I was kind of confused with the default script here. Because as soon as you succeed here, basically, you don't get any callbacks. I did not even get callbacks, I think, to these methods. So, let's see what the output here is. On joined room is actually where I got the callback from. So we got a success on reconnect and rejoin, and then it's on joined room that we actually get back. So you'll see here that we succeed here in theory. We succeed in reconnecting and rejoining, but we don't actually join the room until later. And that's kind of the most important part, is when we actually get back into the game. Because this is basically just saying, oh, we've reconnected to the server. That's not really relevant for us. What we want to, I mean, it's the first step in the process. But the important step is actually getting back into the game. So that's what the on join room represents. And that's why I chose to override those functions, so that I would get basically that call, and then I could know, okay, we've successfully reconnected, so now I can say reconnecting is false. It's no longer happening. Is that it? I think so. So that's it. So basically, it took me a long time to figure out, a few months, but I'm really happy with it. The result, oh, I should mention this. So one of the caveats here is you need to be sure the room doesn't get destroyed before you are able to reconnect to it, right? So in this example, I sort of had it staged in a sense, because I had two players on the same team, and one of those two players was the one I disconnected. And the reason I did that was because if I only had one player on a team and they disconnected, then the game would have assumed, okay, that player disconnected, so they died. So there's no one left on that team, so now we can end the game. And if I try to reconnect, then the game is going to be over, so I'm not going to be able to reconnect. So that's something to keep in mind, is that basically the game needs to still be going on in order for you to reconnect. That is partially helped by the whole empty room scenario, the empty room TTL. But it's just something to keep in mind when you have basically, with the way I normally do some testing, like if I'm testing anything that's not multiplayer, I usually just go in with one character, and I might put a breakpoint on that. And that's something to keep in mind, is basically if you've only got one character in the room, so I'm going to do that, I'm going to start this game with just one guy. If I've only got one guy in the room, then basically he is the master client, right? So the second he disconnects, the room becomes empty, and that timer starts to tick down. So that's why it's important to set that empty room TTL. Okay, well, that about wraps it up. Hopefully we had a good amount of information, helpfulness, and complaining in there to make the video somewhat helpful for you. I'm going to link this to the people I found struggling like me in the forums, in hopes that anyone else who might be encountering this issue has a little bit of good luck to come across my solution, and hopefully it's helpful for them as well. If you're encountering issues with this system, please don't at me in the comments. I don't know what the hell's going on here. I'm just figuring it out just like you. So maybe put a post on their forum, and who knows, maybe one day they'll respond to their own forum requests. All right, I'm being a bitch now. I'll stop. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know. It's been a pleasure, honestly. I really like Photon, actually. Maybe it doesn't sound like it, but I'm actually really happy with this library. I think it's pretty awesome, pretty powerful. So I'm really happy that I got this reconnection thing done. It's a big step for Breach Buddies, because it's gonna speed up development a lot, and I'm looking forward to what's next. So if you'd like to hear more about Breach Buddies and other random tips and nonsense from my YouTube channel, subscribe and hit the like button if this was helpful for you. And leave a comment unless it's a question, in which case please put it on the forums, because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just a dog on the internet. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.